Hi, friends. Well, here it is. I have finished my project and I have started looking up other pieces of information. I finally joined Reddit and I have come across quite a few things that have, let's say, altered my original opinion, or at least probably altered my original opinion, as these are just theories and everything is fluid at this point. My original opinion in that the cops happened upon the incident or happened upon Teresa Halbach, which Colburn calling in the place certainly would indicate. But there are a couple other things that have been brought to my attention that I really think need to be presented and, more importantly, answered, because the two questions that I have that could literally break this case wide open, I can't find anywhere. Nobody seems to have this information, so I'm making this addendum in the hopes that somebody will be able to answer these and bring this forth. So here goes. So I'm going to ask the two questions. I mean, there are more, but the two main questions I have, I'm going to ask them right away so that anybody listening to this can right off the bat I answer them if they do have the answer. And the first one is, who called the shot? Who told Jody that she could not go to that AA meeting? I'm assuming it was AA. That I'm just going to say the AA meeting that day on October 31st. When was that? Because Stephen Avery was supposed to pick her up, but yet, had people coming over, there was a bonfire, etc. But those are the main two parts of the one question. Who called that shot and when was that known? And the second part would be, and I mentioned this also in the presentation in one of the 7 parts, was what caliber bullet killed Teresa Halbach? I've been on Reddit and nobody seems to know. It seems to me from the measurement that it is bigger than a 22, probably about a little bit closer to a 9mm, maybe a 10mm, maybe a little bit smaller than that, but definitely not 5.5 millimeters, which is what a 22 caliber equates to in metric. So those two questions, first off, right off the bat, if you have the answer to them, please let me know in the comments below. But on to the reasoning that I'm thinking that the cops might have had more to do with it because of those two reasons I'm going to go into now. As you could probably tell by my speech patterns, this is more off the cuff than what I had before. I basically wrote out most of everything I had before. This, in the interest of time, is going to be something that is a little bit more off the cuff. So, first that I want to address is the fact that, Stephen Avery was supposed to pick up Jody, but couldn't because she wasn't let out for that meeting. Did that ever happen before? If so, what was the reason? What was the reason this time? Did she misbehave? And I addressed a little bit of this in the presentation. Was there not enough guards on duty? What was the reasoning for it? And then the second part is, when did they know this? Stephen Avery supposedly, had people coming over but canceled. Remember, we stated that. I'm not going to keep saying, I stated it before, because if you listen to it, you pretty much will know. Brendan Dassey was supposed to come over with some people too, which brings me to the point, if you've got people coming over, why would you invite people over if you know darn well that you're going to be at a meeting with Jody? Was it something to where you were planning on bringing her and they allowed that? Was it something you were planning on bringing her and they didn't allow that? After the meeting, during the meeting? I mean, that's something that can get you in real trouble, so I don't think they would risk that, especially with her almost being able to get out in a couple of months. So why would he invite people over knowing that he was going to be with Jody? Which would lead me to believe that that wasn't the case, that he knew in advance, at least way earlier in the day, probably a day before or before that, that Jody wouldn't be coming over, so therefore he decided to throw this bonfire. But again, when did he know this? When was that decision made? Granted, the people canceled, but, where was the heads up? What time would the meeting have been? Then comes the wrinkle that, well, if he was supposed to take Jody, what time? Was her meeting at 4? Was her meeting at 6? Was her meeting at 8? When did they know this? Did they tell her the day before and then she told him? If it was the day before, did they, and they being the cops, did they know something was going to happen? Because that would have given him a rock-solid alibi. You have to go there, sign out paperwork, do all this stuff, sign paperwork back in, which is all time-stamped. So if they were going to try to pin something on him and knew that he had an alibi for it, then the investigators would have been looking in different directions and probably towards them. I mean, that is kind of far-fetched, but again, it goes back to what I was saying before of there's $36 million on the line, and everybody's lives, everyone's reputations, not to mention the scariest aspect, which is law enforcement officers in federal ass-bang prison, like the movie Tango and Cash, and their families left out on the street. But it would have to include a bunch of people. And the reason that, and somebody said this on Reddit, the reason that it almost, would be that she happened to be killed by somebody else, and then the cops got involved. In order for that to happen the way it happened, it would have to happen very fast. If indeed Jody not being able to get out was something that happened that day. In between Teresa Halbach getting murdered, somebody knowing about it, notifying the right person, and then the plans of actions going into effect from that point on. It would have happened very fast. And let's just go there for a second, because this is also assuming that Jody's not being let out is something other than coincidence, something other than just mere happenstance. Because if Teresa goes over to the Zipperers, or even meets, Scott Taddick and Bobby Dassey or Edward, Wayne Edwards, whoever, we'll just say Zipperers for now. They go over to the Zipperers and 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock, she's killed. So that would mean they'd have to contact somebody, say, oh, something happened, what do we do now? And then all those people get contacted. Somebody then has to realize that Teresa was just over at the Avery, so now they've got an opportunity to frame Stephen Avery. And then they call up whoever controls the inmates to say Jody can't be let out today because otherwise that gives Stephen Avery the alibi. And even if her meeting was at 8 o'clock, they have to either tell her or call Stephen Avery to say, hey, don't bother coming to pick her up because she's not getting out today. Not to mention there's a drive time factor, so that pushes the blanket even further. Between 4 and 8 for all that to happen, that's a very short amount of time to put all that in motion. And that's assuming that her meeting was at 8 and not 6 or 4 p.m. So that's kind of another reason why I lean towards the other scenario. That since they had almost a year to plan this whole thing, that this is more than likely set up by the cops in advance, which is of course the absolute worst case scenario. But then again, stranger things have happened. So there is that possibility that this is just happenstance and the cops walked up on her instead of them planning it from the beginning. But again, I don't think so, because then why would they have planned for people coming over for the bonfire, etc. Now, granted, I mentioned that Colburn happening upon the vehicle, calling the plates in on the 3rd, and Clash of Clans on YouTube had figured out that there's somebody in the background, probably Pam Sturm. It does sound like Pam Sturm because obviously I'm kind of familiar with recording equipment, that it says the car's here, like as if she was on the phone talking to somebody else. Well, who was she talking to? Did anybody subpoena her phone records and find that out? Because that will probably start to unravel this. Now, granted, if Colburn is quote-unquote part of this and something was going to go down and Teresa Halbach was supposed to be killed by the police, then why would he call in the police? I mean, he'd probably get the information from somebody, but then again, maybe he called in the information instead of calling the person, called the dispatch, not thinking that it would be recorded. And that might be the crux that does this whole thing in. Then again, another option is maybe Pam Sturm, being a private investigator, started snooping around herself and came upon the vehicle right as Sergeant Colburn was coming up on the vehicle, and he had to call it in to make it look legit. Now, granted, he could have probably, just put the phone to his face and said, oh, I called it in. But, why wouldn't he call Lieutenant Lank or somebody else involved in it? Again, probably didn't know it was being recorded. But if she interrupted him doing something with the car, then where does she fall into place? Because remember, she was the one who found the car. She was the one who showed up late. She was the one that was given the map, the camera, and the direct line. So it's almost as if she fits into this too. So was she in on it from the beginning? Or was this something to where they just kind of played it along from there? That's a little bit more believable, at least to me. But it all is so weird. This right here is kind of the only thing that really knocks my theory out of the park, because if Colburn was one that was deposed, he was the one that took the call about Avery's blood in 1995, he would be one that would be intimately involved. So, he wouldn't risk calling the dispatcher, and he wouldn't, risk doing anything with Pam Sturm that wasn't necessary. Then again, There is another option that he called Pam Sturm because he knew that the vehicle needed to be found by somebody other than the police. So maybe that was part of their plan, but I still don't understand where that phone call comes in because that is the one thing that just throws this argument. So it's almost this weird puzzle to where every single time we come really close to maybe solving something, there's one thing in this that completely contradicts the theory at hand. Then you have to link in Pam Sturm with the ex Ryan Hillegas and her brother Mike Halbach in order for this thing to kind of come full circle. So again, are all these people involved, or were they given just enough information, or did they just all hate Stephen Avery that much? But I find it kind of odd that Pam Sturm would find the car, probably be able to see blood because she's a private investigator, and not get freaked out, and yet be so into making sure that Stephen Avery gets framed for this. Wouldn't she want to know what really happened? I mean, Teresa Halbach was her second cousin, if memory serves. So this is all very, very confusing. So my theory in this is that, the cops needed her in order to pinpoint it, but convinced her that Stephen Avery did it. So therefore they set the ball in motion. They said, well, we're going to set him up and make sure this bastard burns. And that was the extent of Pam Sturm, Ryan Hillegas, and Mike Halbach's involvement in it. They need Pam Sturm, who's a private investigator, somebody who would be believable, to find it on Avery's property with the consent to search. They would also need the cooperation from Ryan Hillegas in finding out or making sure that voicemails were erased, and they would need Mike Halbach to get the key from in order to make sure that Stephen Avery got properly framed for this. And of course, those two were also instrumental in running the search party, so the cops could kind of do whatever they wanted and put those guys and give them the special permission to do certain things. So whatever the cops needed to do, they could kind of do through them. They could do it incognito, and since it was an ex and a brother, nobody would be the wiser. Now, granted, multiple things could have happened, so if anyone else has any theories on this, I'd really like to hear them. There's also something to be pointed out with the ex, Ryan Hillegas, who was a nurse. Now, if you've ever watched the show Third Watch, it's a show about New York and the police department, fire department, and the EMT/hospital, and all of their involvements in the same case. So say there's a drunk driving accident. The police go there to investigate, the fire department puts out the fire, and then the EMTs bring the guy to the hospital, and the doctors work on him, and the cops go and interview, how did this happen? So it's kind of, a team effort in that sort of sense. There's also coroners involved and DAs involved in that kind of stuff with other crimes, etc. But if he was a nurse and he knew some of the police involved in this, and say he maybe had some stalking raps that he needed to get rid of, or say they came to him and said, hey, you looked into her voicemail, that's a crime, we need you to do X, Y, Z. Even her brother, how did they get the key? Where was her original key? So, where did they get the spare key? Because unless you are a person who owns the car, you can't go into a dealership and ask for a key, especially if the key has a computer chip in it, which I don't think hers would have had. But in order for you to get a key, not a duplicate, in order for you to get a key, you actually have to go to the dealership and present, your ID, your registration, and basically proof that you bought the car from them in order to get that. And if you're the police, well, yeah, you could do that, but then there's a paper trail there. So how did they get the key? So my guess is that, the ex fits in there somewhere in some way because of being a nurse and because he was involved with the police department and the fire department through that particular job he had. But regarding the police doing it on purpose, if this was planned in advance because the depositions were happening, then what I'm about to say makes a little bit more sense. This wasn't in the documentary, but doing some online research, I found out there was another person of interest by the name of George Zipperer, Zipperer. Now in Wisconsin, there's a lot of German names, Shearer, Booker, Wooker, that have ER, but it's pronounced Zipper. You'll also remember during the phone call when Detective Wiegert calls Detective Remacher and says, the boss wants us to do something. Boss has a change of plans a couple hours before the car is found by Pam Sturm. You'll notice that he says the boss wants us to go over to Avery and Zipperer and interview them again. There's a search party there, and he wants to ask permission to search, meaning search both properties, even though now, because of Colburn going over there, they know that the Averys are now up north. up north there, hey. Not to mention the fact that they probably know that Teresa Halbach's vehicle is already on the Avery property and Pam Sturm, with permission, is rearing and ready to find it. Detective Remacher, who is also supposedly some sort of distant relative from Mr. Zipperer, scoffs and goes, Zipperer's not going to be too happy about that. Not Avery's not going to be too happy about that. He said Zipperer's not going to be too happy about that. And then Detective Wiegert says, well, if he says no, he says no, in regards to the search. Which, of course, when all of us heard that, we had no idea this Zipperer that they were talking about. Well, it turns out Mr. Zipperer is the last place that Teresa Halbach actually went, which should have been a red flag to the entire investigation, but regardless. So George Zipper, who is apparently an old belligerent guy, was stating that Teresa Halbach was trespassing, also has a grandson that lives with him named Jason, I think was recently busted for drugs. And say, for example, if he's growing pot on Grandpa's land, Grandpa's liable for it. But it seems that the last stop that Teresa Halbach actually made was supposedly to the Zippers, and Granny Zipper really, even though she testified, couldn't remember much of what happened that day. But if you think about it let's hypothesize some conspiracy theories here. If Zipper, who happens to also be related to a deputy Zipper, who supposedly also happens to be related to Jean Cachet, at the time, I believe it was chief deputy, the guy who made the sketch, and even after Stephen Avery was exonerated, in his deposition stated that he wasn't really sure that Stephen Avery could be innocent, even though obviously everybody knows that is 100% the case. And the only other person to share that sentiment was, of course, Sheriff Peterson. But if all these people who are related to Mr. Zipper, including, and this one is what made my jaw drop and what made me really make this, was the evidence clerk, court evidence clerk from Manitowoc County, is a Chris, K-R-I-S, female, Zipper. Kind of makes one think. So if you're thinking that, okay, a lot of people had to be involved, yeah, a lot of people very well could have been involved. Because if Mr. Zipper, like a lot of people in the town, are kind of related to each other, and if, say, Mr. Zipper either had troubles with the law, say, like I said, grandson got busted for pot, maybe it was on his land, if they said, hey, we could make this all go away if you just do X, Y, and Z, maybe turn the other cheek, maybe the guy was kind of like Jack Ruby, all right, maybe he's got some health ailments, and hey, whatever, I'm not going to be around. I don't know. I don't know if the guy's still alive. I haven't done that much research into it, but it does state the probability that it could have happened to where this all was put into motion. They knew somehow that Teresa Halbach was going to be at Avery's that day, and they put in a phone call for a car that, as far as I know, Teresa Halbach never even really took pictures for. So they lure her over there, and if you think about it, you can slyly go, oh, well, I come over here, I don't know where it is, so then she goes to Avery's and then comes back there to say, oh, we were scheduled for before Avery's, so I don't know what to tell you. So that is something that can be theorized, but also, if they knew that Teresa Halbach was going to visit Stephen Avery, this is something that is going to take some digging to find out, but again, phone records might be pertinent, because who called that? Supposedly the granny, but Granny didn't really know the car, didn't really have any idea what was going on, kind of thing. And then, of course, the old man saying, she's trespassing. And that also could have been something to where if he did get caught, murdering her, shooting her in the head with a caliber that nobody knows yet. Does he have that caliber gun? Say it was a 10 millimeter or 7 millimeter. But if he did get caught, it's, oh yeah, well, she was trespassing. I thought she was a trespasser. Even though it's kind of odd, because if it's grandpa, then grandpa's probably 60, 70, 80 years old. All right, been around, living in the country. A lot of people walk on other people's land. They don't know where the boundaries are. Hunting, especially hunting season. So he's not, I'm sure he's not unfamiliar with people, walking onto his land. I'm sure he's dealt with it before. Plus, Teresa was a 25-year-old skinny female. I really don't think the old man would have had anything to worry about with her that, a simple question wouldn't have solved versus a mortal gunshot wound to the head. But either way, it goes to say that if he did kill her, did get caught, he can at least say, well, I thought she was a trespasser. And if he did end up getting convicted of it, well, he's an old man. I don't know. Like I said, I don't know if he's alive or got health ailments, but that does go to say, hey, maybe this, because again, if you think, parallels to the Kennedy case, maybe there's some similarities there. Perhaps he figured, hey, I'm kind of like Jack Ruby. Even if I get caught, I'm going to kick it soon anyway, but at least my grandson gets to go free. Also, I'd have to find out more about what the grandson Jason was involved with. Apparently, he too had some sort of, not necessarily aggression issues, but issues of being belligerent. Police would probably know this. But again, if they're the Zipperers related to the Zipperer family, they might have had some preferential treatment, or to say, hey, tell you what, like I said, you do this for us and we'll make all this stuff go away. So from there, assuming they were able to lure her, Teresa Halbach, to that property, if the old man or somebody shoots her, all right, well, what happens next? Well, obviously her body ends up in the back. Obviously, Colburn calls it in. So what does happen? Some theorize that there was an anonymous letter written to the Green Bay media that another sheriff has a smelter, like the Averys do. Another sheriff has a smelter on his property, which again would include more people, but also would include the sheriff's department. I mentioned before that there's also the coroner and the morgue. You would basically only need a few pieces of evidence, like the skull, to prove, okay, she was shot, to say a certain narrative. You would need some DNA to prove it was Teresa, and then, miraculously one tooth was there. Well, where did the other ones go? Two teeth are just as hard as bone, so where did all this end? And of course, there was also and I didn't mention this one before, there was a button for jeans. So it was almost like, we just need to place one or two little key pieces of things in here to make sure that they understand that it is Teresa Halbach. But assuming that, and assuming they use a smelter to get rid of the body, then it goes to, okay, Colburn goes over to ask, Stephen Avery questions on the 3rd when she's reported a missing person. Is supposedly then he already knows that, where the vehicle is, and they find out the next day they're leaving, coincidentally, to go up north to Derhe, and they know that they can pretty much do anything, and they plant everything that they need to plant on the property. And Pam Sturm, who I still am questioning, she's a private investigator. She probably knows how to do certain things. All of a sudden, gets, divine intervention when, again, she was the only one that got a map, that got a direct line to Sheriff Poggle, and got a camera, even though she was the last one to go to the search party. And she supposedly never met the ex before, but why would she get all of those things? And the direct line, I realized that the direct line to Sheriff Poggle was answered by none other than Mr. Mark Wiegert. Mark Wiegert, who also, coincidentally, is the one to interview Brendan Dassey and put all this into his head, as stated in one of the presentations. Now, again, this may seem pretty far-fetched, but what did I say at the beginning of my presentations? MMO, means motive opportunity. Motive is usually the clincher. Sure, you've got certain things like Scott Toddick and Bobby Dassey, perhaps maybe raped her, supposedly. Scott Toddick was going through the full tilt boogie, was a nervous wreck. It was even in one of the transcripts from the court that I read, but it could have been a nervous wreck because his mom was sick. So again, it could be worth exploring. And of course, with Colburn calling in the place, was it a stupid move, or was it something that he just stumbled upon and then the wheels put into motion? But one of the things that kind of makes me think that that's not the case was, if that was the case and it's just happenstance that they didn't let her out that day, then all this happening so fast that, we don't know that the Averys are going to be out of town, but they are. And how do we, get the body, burned? Or where do they find the body? To put all that together in a span of 24 hours would be very hard to do. Not saying it's not possible. I'm not saying that luck couldn't be on the side, but I literally, if I go out and take my garbage out at 3 o'clock in the morning, which I've done a couple times, there's somebody walking their dog on 3 o'clock on a Tuesday, at 3 a.m. So granted, I live in a much more populated area, but and this one time, I probably shouldn't say this, but this is 20 years ago. And a buddy of mine, we were over by his grandparents' house, and he was turkey hunting, and he got a turkey, and he wanted to get another turkey, which is not really legal. But he needed to ditch the one that he had before he tagged it in, so he basically cut the meat out of it and was looking for a place. And I didn't know this at the time because it was, why are you driving around? It's, kept driving in circles, and I really kind of started to get scared. And then, but the thing is there were cars. We're in the middle of nowhere. It's 1 o'clock in the morning. And there's just cars. It's like he couldn't even take it to where he could find, a ditch, an abandoned ditch to where there wasn't cars coming or going in the middle of nowhere to throw this dead turkey on the side of the road so that he could go and kill another one without, having to buy a license, even though you couldn't because there's a limit of one. But I'm kind of saying is that it's kind of difficult to do, which is why I find it amazing. You watch these crime shows, and there's these, the Hollywood Strangler. They, dump the bodies on these roads, the only roads in and out of the Hollywood Hills, and they never got caught. So, not to say that it couldn't happen, but it's much more plausible to me that something was set up because of the key, which would be the motive. So, if you take Scott Toddick and Bobby Dassey, and either they wanted to kill her or they wanted to rape her and then kill her, because the burn barrels were right, there, the John to burn barrels. But still, that to motive, them not doing it ever again, them not doing it before, versus the key motive of $36 million in lives being ruined, it seemed almost more prevalent to me that this was something that the depositions were going on, and before it finally hit the top, somebody called in the hit, so to speak, and put that into motion. So I think it's kind of important to go into investigating this, because not only do you end up exonerating Stephen Avery, but you solve the crime. Perry Mason used to do that. Scooby-Doo used to do that. So, it's kind of nice to do, two birds with one stone versus just setting Stephen Avery and Brendan Dassey free, although that is the ultimate goal here. But I would really like to see these bastards behind bars, especially if it is law enforcement. Then the second part to this is something that I brought up in the series: the caliber or size of bullet that entered Teresa Halbach's skull. Nobody, as far as I know, including the defense, has said anything about this, and I don't know why, because this pretty much could exonerate Stephen Avery hands down, because if he only had a 50 caliber or a 22 caliber, which is basically the minimum and maximum of bullet sizes for anyone who knows guns or hunting. I mean, obviously there are bigger and smaller, but for practical purposes, it's kind of like a car. You've got the, Yugo, and you got the Ford Excursion. There's Hummers and there's tanks, but most people don't have those lying around. But if it was something other than a 22, then even if the 22 bullet, the magic bullet found in the garage afterward, had Teresa Halbach's DNA on it, then by definition it's planted, because if a bigger bullet than a 22 killed her, then he's off the hook. So right there should be something that they need to consider in order to get him released, because that's probably the easiest one that they could look into. And there's going to be some out there, well, if a bullet goes through, sometimes it might make a bigger hole. No. It doesn't. That's why when you see, even the video games do a good job of this. The bullets go through the cars on drive-by shootings. They're all the same size. Now, the paint that comes and follows to be taken off is in random patterns, but the hole is always the same size because of the way physics work. It punches through and it makes that perfect hole. Now, the exit wound is a different story, but then again, they only found certain pieces of her skull, right? Certain key pieces that, a cop might be able to say, oh, we need this one, this one, this one to prove it was a bullet hole, but we don't want to have this other one because if the exit wound shows this big splatter, then you could say, okay, well, it's probably, this size, or this size. Or if there's actually, for a very small purpose that the bullet would actually go through before the explosion of the brain, like the Kennedy assassination, that they can actually tell what caliber bullet and match both of them up to get an even better, more accurate example. But they don't even need that, because the entrance wound always, I'm sure there's a slight variation of not being the case, but always is the same size as the bullet. And that's just the way it works. So they need to figure out what caliber bullet hit her. Now, I have seen the skull fragment pieces, and if there's 4 pieces, the top right portion seems to be missing, and it seems to have come in at an angle. Now, I don't know if that's the rear or occipital bones, or if that was the temporal bone above the left ear. Either way, it looked like it came in at an angle, almost as if it was the left side that she was facing somebody, or if it was the bottom, that it was either shot from an angle, the top, or the bottom, which would indicate, bam, shooting somebody once, and then if they're face down, you shoot them again as you're standing over them, which would angle it into the skull. So these two things are going to be what could hands down, number one, exonerate Stephen Avery, and two, give us a good clue as to who really committed the murder. Because if we can find out the caliber bullet used, all right, and if it's something that is pretty much indicative of only a rifle, then we find out who owned a caliber rifle like that. More than likely, it's probably going to be old man Zipperer. And then the second part would be to find out who called in Jody's no-go. And when you start looking into those phone records, into what was said, somebody's going to squeal, because you get one person in on this and they all know that it's over. It's going to be a house of cards and dominoes. They're going to come tumbling down until you finally get to the guy like Colonel Jessup in the movie A Few Good Men. You can't handle the truth. It's going to get to him. Did you order the code red? You're goddamn right I did. And that's going to be it. And that's going to solve the case. And whoever gets this is probably going to be, probably going to be, going to the Emmys and the Oscars for the next year or two. But somebody please answer these questions for me, because again, if I can find the answers to these, then I can at least dig a little bit further, and maybe I can even start making some phone calls, given my hidden position, to see if I can't start rattling some cages. So it's dangerous ground to walk on, but somebody's got to do it. So please, share this with everybody you can, the whole thing, and especially these two, because these are the two I really need answers to. So hopefully we'll have some more information I can do